Okay, so here we have two of probably the most popular and sought after 16-inch gaming laptops of 2024. The Asus Zephyrus G16 and the Lenovo Legion 7i. So here we have the AMD version of the G16, but I also had the Intel version that I'm going to give comparisons with as well. Both of which I have full reviews for already on my channel, so definitely go check that out after this. And then the Legion 7i here is the Intel 14900HX model. Keep in mind though that Lenovo has changed their naming scheme over the years. I see a lot of people that still confuse this one with the Legion 7s of 2021 and 2022, when this is actually in fact the renamed version of the Legion Slim 7, and the old Legion 7s were renamed to the Legion Pro 7. So that's why you might still hear some people call this the Slim 7. Now, I can already hear some comments on the way saying like, oh brother, this guy hates Legion laptops. But nah, I personally find both Lenovo and Asus to be some of the best laptop makers out there, so please don't take my criticisms too seriously here. Just because there's something I don't like about a laptop doesn't mean that you won't either. I'll have some objective data, but also some personal takes and subjective reasons why I came to the conclusions that I did. Regardless, there's truly something for everyone in both of these laptops, but there are also some critical differences that set them apart. It's funny to me how similar and yet how different these two laptops are. Speaking of differences that set things apart, Ugreen has some dope new chargers called the Ugreen Uno, and I'm happy to have them sponsor this video. As a brand that I regularly use and love, I've had a lot of people tell me how happy they are with Ugreen products, and I think this Uno line is one of the most unique I've seen in this space. Starting with the Ugreen Uno Charger 100 watt, you can now enjoy a fast and fun charging accessory for something like the new iPhone, like my 16 Pro here, or for charging your G16 or Legion at 100 watts, or charging 4 devices at once like I did here. The smart display is super fun with the little status emoji on it, which changes to different emojis, but can also change faces depending on charging status. And of course, with this being a GAN charger, it's compact and super fast with 100 watts from either of the first two ports here, which can charge an iPhone 16 from 0 to 57% in just 30 minutes. The next one here is the Ugreen Uno Magnetic Wireless Power Bank 15 watts. Again, great for the new iPhone with 10,000 milliamp hours and 15 watts of fast charging output. It's Qi 2 certified and can fully charge an iPhone 16 Pro like this one here 1.6 times. Also, it's fairly compact and you could definitely fit it in your pocket. Not to mention the cool stand here as an added bonus. And again, you gotta love that emoji status icon, which changes expressions based on the charging level. With both of these charging devices, I feel like I've got two fun little companions to take on the road with me and help keep my devices juiced up. I mean, come on, look at the shoes on this guy. Like, how can you not love that? Anyways, if you're interested, check out the link in my description. Ugreen is running a Black Friday sale right now, so definitely go check these out. And thank you again, Ugreen, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Okay, let's talk design first, because there's a couple key differences here right off the bat. Despite both being 16-inch laptops, the G16 is noticeably smaller and lighter than the Legion 7i. I honestly understand now why they probably took Slim off the Legion 7i name, because yeah, this difference in size is going to come into play for the rest of this review, so just keep that in mind. I've said it before in my reviews, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the G16 is essentially an Ultrabook. Like an Ultrabook that has way more performance than any Ultrabook. Like, look at the size comparison to the Samsung Galaxy Book 4 Ultra. It's almost the same weight and dimensions as that. When you compare it to the Legion 7i, it starts to look like a pretty big difference. And the Legion 7i, while it's definitely thinner and lighter than the Pro 7i counterpart, it's actually very close to the Legion Pro 7i of 2022 and 2021, if any of you remember those. But about half a pound lighter, but still almost a whole pound heavier than the G16. Even when they're right next to each other, you can immediately tell the difference in size between the two. But again, keep this in mind moving forward, especially when we talk about performance. As far as materials go, both are aluminum, but I've got to say the CNC aluminum on the G16 looks much better to me personally. It's almost more of a silvery tone in comparison to the Legion, and I don't know, to me that just looks so nice. Like, it just screams, hey, I'm a laptop made of metal, and sort of gives you a MacBook look that's hard to ignore. For the Legion, it still looks great though. This is the nicest looking to me in comparison to all the other Legion laptops, and I would definitely prefer the white finish, as the gray one to me looks a little basic. Like, it is white with a silvery sort of wrap around the sides, and I dig it. The only thing I don't like is it's got kind of a booty, alright? But that is pretty standard for Legion laptops, and it helps with cooling a little bit, so I get it. And the charging brick is also bulkier and heavier on the Legion. I kind of feel like it's oversized, and they definitely could have included something smaller than this. Even the cables are thicker and harder to bend and fit in a bag. Also, both of these are great at hiding fingerprints and scratches, but I did notice some spots and scratches on the top of my Legion. I did buy this off of somebody though. It just has me wondering, like, how did that happen? And you know, I just hope it's not something that would be easy to have happened to someone else's laptop. Overall, I'd give the design to the G16 here. To me, it is like the best looking gaming laptop that I've personally ever seen so far, and a pretty bold move by Asus when typically Razer was the only one to make these sort of sleek CNC metal designs like this. As for keyboards, you get 1.7 millimeters of travel on the G16 and 1.5 millimeters of key travel on the Legion. I thought this was interesting since the G16 is thinner, so it has less room to work with, but whatever. I do notice the extra travel, and I personally like typing on the G16's keyboard more, but I know a lot of people who are huge fans of the keycaps on Legion laptops, so if that's your thing, then you might like the Legions more. Also, the Legion gets per key RGB, which I love to see. I really wish Asus would go ahead and just give us per key RGB on the Zephyrus models. I don't understand why they haven't done that yet for such a premium device. And of course, I'm not a fan of numpads. Some of you might know it moves everything on the laptop to the left, where my hands are almost off the laptop when I'm gaming. The trackpad becomes off-centered, and now you have to sacrifice up-firing speakers for it. I'd much rather just buy a cheap $10 USB numpad off Amazon if I really needed it. But again, this could be a huge selling point for some of you number crunchers out there, or maybe some of you speaker lovers out there. And the trackpads really are nice on both. I would say both are equally as smooth, but again, I gotta give the win here to the G16 for having a much bigger trackpad with a much quieter click. All right, now let's tackle the displays, because this is going to be one of the biggest differences between these two machines. But first of all, if you're considering getting either of these laptops, I highly recommend using one of the affiliate links in my description or in the pinned comment, as that greatly helps support the channel. Anyways, I'd say the majority of people are going to much prefer the G16s, especially when you see them side by side. The G16 has an OLED QHD display running at 240 Hz, 100% DCI-P3 with about 400 nits of brightness. They claim about 500 peak with HDR. The Legion will commonly have a 1600p IPS display, as seen on the Best Buy model, running at 240 Hz and about 500 nits of brightness, with about 79% DCI-P3 coverage. We'll talk about the other display option in a second and why I don't recommend that one. So right off the bat, the color gamut is different between the two. And yes, this is noticeable. The colors are going to pop on the G16, and not only from it being OLED, but from the higher color gamut being 100% DCI-P3, and the G16 is also going to have a nearly instant response time due to the OLED technology. So 240 Hz, I'd argue, just feels smoother on OLED than it does on IPS. Motion clarity is just insanely good here. You also have a big difference on the G16 having a glossy display with flat glass bezels, and the Legion having a matte display with the standard plastic bezels around it. That's a personal thing, but I much prefer glossy displays and glass bezels like that. It just looks way more premium to me. Like the contrast and sharpness, clarity all feel amazing, and you have nothing poking off the laptop's display. The most apparent difference between the two is going to be contrast. OLED displays have perfect contrast, whereas the blacks on the Legion will always appear gray in comparison, with the possibility of screen bleed as well, which may make things look worse. Despite the brightness differences, I didn't really notice the Legion to be much brighter. All of these differences though become the most apparent in HDR, where the G16 actually appears much brighter, and things are almost popping off the screen in comparison to the Legion here. As you can see in this clip, like contrast is amazing, sharpness is amazing. I cannot say enough about how good the G16's display looks. Not that the Legion's is bad, but I just think in 2024, to at least not have a full color gamut panel is just weird at this point. I mean, the Zephyrus models have been doing this since like 2021 or even earlier than that, so I'm just not sure why they didn't improve on the display at this price point. And text clarity is usually a big thing against OLED panels, but when I was looking at them side by side, I personally couldn't see a very noticeable difference in clarity. To me, it looked nearly the same, but I mean, if I had to put a number on it, I'd say like maybe 5% better text clarity on the Legion. This could be to do with the G16 having a better subpixel layout than most OLEDs, which I'll talk about when mentioning burn-in. Because yes, burn-in is the obvious downside of OLED. You know, there's no guarantee of the laptop not having some sign of burn-in within like a few years, maybe 5 years, maybe even 10 years. But honestly, I'm not really afraid of burn-in nearly as much anymore, because there's so many more technologies built into these panels, such as pixel refresh, pixel shift, and other Asus recommended settings that I feel like could easily net you many years without burn-in. And that's coming from someone who has OLED monitors, OLED TVs in their house, and I have for years now with no issues. So obviously I can't guarantee that, but I feel like with the basic precautions, the risk should be pretty low. Plus the subpixel layout here, which I believe is S-Stripe, correct me if I'm wrong based on this, but it's actually supposedly the best for burn-in resistance for OLEDs. Now, the other Legion display option you have is a 3.2K 165 Hz display at 430 nits, with this one actually having the higher color gamut of 100% DCI-P3, but I'd argue against getting that display unless you prefer resolution above everything. A 3.2K display is just going to bring your FPS down in running games, and you're going to lose sharpness when you run games at 1600p to combat that. So you get a lower refresh rate, a lower brightness, and at 16 inches, I'd be hard pressed if you'd actually notice a difference between 3.2K and QHD without like a magnifying glass or using some insane window scaling option. You might notice it in the date and time on your taskbar, but that's probably about it. Not worth the hassle to me. I'd still think 1600p is the sweet spot on laptops. I also had a random issue sometimes on the Legion where it wouldn't come back from 60 Hz automatically after being plugged back in. So I'd have to manually go into Windows settings and change it from 60 Hz to 240 Hz, which wasn't a huge deal, but just kind of annoying. One thing that was brought up in some reviews with the G16 was screen wobble, but the actual user experience doesn't seem to be nearly as bad as some of the reviews made it seem. In fact, I find it to be pretty in line with the Legion and most other gaming laptops, although I do find the AMD model of the G16, which is slightly newer, to have a bit less wobble with a bit tighter hinges. Alright, so speakers. So this is the next big win here for the G16. If you plan on gaming with the laptop speakers or listening to music, it's just a massive difference. Like, as of 2024, the G16 has some of the best sounding laptop speakers on the market. Here's a sound sample using a song I wrote and had AI produce for me.
These laptop speakers sound good. Do they sound the way that they should? Which one do you think sounds best in this laptop speaker test? Laptop speakers came down over the air. These laptop speakers sound so loud and clear. Can you hear the noise? Did your eardrums get destroyed by these laptop speakers? Yeah, they're playing for you.
I also have a webcam test, which I'll show you right here. All right, webcam test on the Zephyrus G16. A webcam test on the 2024 Legion 7i. I think the webcam looks and sounds better on the G16, but I'll leave that up for interpretation. All right, so fan noise. So fans are actually really similar here. One thing I appreciate is the 0 RPM fans on the G16 when you're doing very basic tasks or when it's on idle. The Legion basically always has its fan spinning in silent mode, but I gotta give it to them. They're very quiet and hard to notice. And technically you can achieve 0 RPM fans on the Legion with Legion Toolkit, but boy, does the body of the laptop get hot when you do this. It gets insane. So definitely don't recommend that. I can see why they left it with fans on all the time for that reason. Silent gaming under load, however, the Legion wins by a little bit. In balance mode, the G16 wins by a little bit, and in turbo mode, they're both about the same. However, the Intel model of the G16, the 4080 or 4091 with the vapor chamber, is a bit quieter across the board than both of these. And there were some complaints initially about the G16 having a whiny third fan, but that seems to have been fixed by a BIOS update, and also you can manually turn that third fan off. But regardless, to me, they sound pretty identical in pitch and volume. Here's a sound sample. All right, so now here's the fan noise to time spy graphics score ratio. This basically shows you, how much performance you get out of the laptop for each decibel of fan noise. And I have it separated by the 3 power profiles for each laptop because, sometimes that makes a really big difference. Maybe a laptop does really bad in turbo mode as far as fan noise, but it gives you great performance in balance mode. So let's compare these two here. You want these bars, like the fan noise here, to be as low as possible. And then you want these bars, the time spy graphics score to fan noise ratio, to be as high as possible. This is how many points you get per decibel of fan noise. So in turbo mode, the G16 is kind of middle of the road. I mean, it's right up there with most other laptops, about 245 points per decibel, 49.5 decibels of fan noise. The Legion's just barely above it, 251 points per decibel and 50 decibels. In balance mode, it's pretty close, but the Legion does get a little bit more ahead here, hitting about 44 decibels, 261 points per decibel, whereas the G16 is 43.5 decibels, 243 points per decibel. So still not a huge difference, and obviously keep in mind these higher tier GPUs are going to have a bias here because they just perform much better, typically, especially in their higher performance profiles. The silent mode, the Legion actually gets ahead by a decent little amount here, 284 points per decibel at only 32.5 decibels, which is pretty darn quiet. And then 34.5 decibels on the G16, 234 points per decibel, right in there with most other 4070s. So I'd say both are pretty average for your 4070 laptop, but the Legion does give you a little more performance in that silent mode especially. And normally I would go straight into thermals next, but before we get there, I want to talk about the CPU. So there's a big difference here with the CPU, okay? The Legion comes with an i9-14900HX or an i7-14700HX. Now, I see this as a pro and a con, and you'll see why in a second. On the positive side, this is a very powerful CPU. It's essentially the same CPU as the 13900HX, just clocked a little higher. Like literally nothing else has changed between those two chips. They are the same. Both Raptor Lake chips, same core count, same number of threads. The only difference is the boost clock speed. So yeah, very high peak performance. That's what those chips target. They don't really target efficiency. They don't really target performance at low wattage. They target high wattage, high performance. But the problem is the Legion doesn't quite have the thermal headroom to push it to where that CPU needs to go. So in Cinebench R23, which pushes the CPU to its max, you'll see it starts to lose to the 13900HX laptops from last year using the same chip, even though this one is supposed to run at a higher boost clock speed. Now, you can help this out by using like a cooling pad or undervolting the CPU, but for this comparison, we're strictly stock. So I'd recommend if you get this laptop, I would probably go for the i7 model because you're not really going to notice a difference beyond some benchmark scores, and it might even run cooler for you. The G16, on the other hand, has the new Ryzen AI 9 HX370, which is a mouthful, or it might be equipped with the Intel Core Ultra 7 or Core Ultra 9 CPUs. These are both efficient CPUs, which are designed to run at a lower wattage, but give you a lot more performance at those low watts so that they don't need to boost as high. And the Ryzen one is especially good in that department and runs surprisingly cool too. So yeah, I mean, the HX CPUs, like I said, look great in benchmarks, but even still, the AMD G16 is right behind it, even though it's running at almost half the wattage, which is crazy. The Intel Core Ultra doesn't have as high peak performance as these other two, but it also has some tricks up its sleeve as well in efficiency, and we'll get to that. So for the AMD model, it does well across the board. Same thing in balance mode, in silent mode, even on battery. It is still hitting over 20,000 points in Cinebench R23. It barely loses any multi-core or single-core performance across the board. And again, that's just efficiency. If we look at this power scaling graph, this will kind of explain what's happening here. Me personally, I tend to prefer more efficient CPUs only because in games on a laptop, your laptop is typically only using like 20 to maybe 50 watts on the CPUs, and that's where the majority of the performance lies on these more efficient chips. Rarely ever will your CPU go to that 100 watt mark, which is where the 14900HX really starts to excel. But you can see here, you could be in a game chilling at just 20 watts, CPU's running cool, and you're getting the equivalent of like 45 watts on the Legion CPU. So for quite a bit of these, you're running at like half the wattage, same performance level. You know, the AMD chip is pretty much better up until about 90 watts than the 14900HX, and then the Core Ultra is better up until about 60 watts, which again is rare to see in games. So yeah, that's what I like about both of these chips. They can run at really low wattage and give the GPU all the headroom that it needs in games, especially the AMD model. Like, it just demolishes the competition at that range. Another CPU difference between all of these is the core-to-core latency. This can have a small effect in some games, although it's hard to say which ones are more affected than others, but it definitely could be one of the reasons why, like I pointed out in my full review of the AMD G16, why you see the Intel model sometimes come out ahead even though it has the same GPU on the same game. It's been reported that a fix is on the way from AMD that will get pushed out via a BIOS update from Asus or some sort of driver update from AMD. So definitely be on the lookout for that if you get the AMD G16. But yeah, right now, as of the time of recording this video in October 2024, that update is not out, and the AMD G16 has a pretty high core-to-core latency of nearly 100 nanoseconds versus like 65-ish on the Lenovo Legion and like 45 or so on the Intel G16. And now all these are higher than like the 20 or so nanoseconds on the 2023 G14, which had the Ryzen 9 7940HS. Now, one thing that comes with good efficiency on the CPU is good battery life. So again, that's where the G16 excels. With just the basic battery saving tools built into the laptop, I could average about 10 hours of YouTube playback on the AMD model and then 9.5 hours on the Intel Core Ultra model. The Legion couldn't even come close in this regard, which is something to consider if you plan on traveling at all with these laptops. You also get excellent performance on battery with the integrated graphics on both the Intel Core Ultra and even more so on the AMD's Radeon 890M. All right, so I think creators are going to like either of these laptops, although I do think many might lean towards the G16 after seeing some of these benchmarks. First of all, the latency mon results. I was getting pretty terrible DPC latency out of the Legion. Automatically makes me think like, okay, there's got to be a driver or something. Hopefully nothing at the hardware level, but something is getting in the way from good, reliable audio video playback. G16, on the other hand, was looking great in that department. So you'll notice like Photoshop, the Intel model of the G16 is kind of neck and neck with with the Legion, but the AMD G16 just excels here. It's like not even close. Like even on battery, the G16 is better than most laptops plugged in. And it's the same deal with balance mode and silent mode. The G16 just kills it here. In Premiere Pro, they're pretty much neck and neck unless you go with like the 4080 or 4090 G16. But yeah, even in balance and silent mode, very close, with the G16 only really pulling ahead on battery. And DaVinci Resolve, the Puget benchmark for DaVinci Resolve recently changed, so I don't have much data here, but again, they're pretty neck and neck. These are great scores. DaVinci Resolve actually does rely on the CPU a good bit, so you'll notice they both are pretty close to like the 4090 G16 at times. So that's really good to see. So overall for creators, both of these laptops are excellent. I will say if you're using Photoshop, the AMD G16 is like unbeatable in that regard. Now, if you're doing music on any of these laptops, they're all going to serve you really well. I run the demo that's included in Ableton Live, which you can download for free if you ever wanted to benchmark your laptop to compare. The way I measure is you want to see low CPU usage in that top right corner right there. So the AMD and Intel G16 both hit about low to mid 20% right there, which is a really good result. The Legion actually does even better than that when it's in its turbo mode, hitting like 17-18%, which is really low, but it's super loud. The fans ramp up like crazy when it's doing this. Doesn't make sense if you're trying to record music to have fans going full blast the whole time. So I thought it was more realistic to actually use balance mode for this one, which brought it to like about the same as the others, like low to mid 20s. But I mean, I'm showing both just in case. All right, now let's talk thermals. So starting with keyboard temperatures, I'd say the Intel model of the G16 and the Legion 7i are pretty much right on point with each other as far as keyboard temps. So the G16 silent mode on battery, you're looking at about mid 30s in the center of the keyboard, about low 30s on the sides. Legion 7i is sort of the same, just slightly warmer, like mid to high 30s in the center, low 30s on the sides. Just keep in mind like the area around like the enter key is going to be a little warmer on the Legion just because the keyboard is shifted to the left. And those of you using it on your lap, the Legion is about mid to upper 30s in the center, and then it gets closer to 40 degrees near the hinge of the laptop. G16 is a little cooler in this regard, especially towards the bottom, but yeah, you're looking at low to mid 30s and about 36 or so near the hinge. Silent mode plugged in, you're looking like 39-ish in the center, low 30s on the sides on the G16. The Legion's like slightly cooler in this regard, like mid to high 30s in the center and low 30s on the side as well. Gaming in silent mode, you're looking at low 40s in the center on the Legion, again low 30s on the sides, about the same as on the G16. Balance mode is like high 30s in the middle, 29 to low 30s on the sides on the G16. The Legion gets a little warmer here, like low to mid 40s in the middle and still low 30s on the sides. And then in turbo, it's still about the same on the G16, like high 30s touching 40 and then upper 20s to low 30s on the sides. The Legion's like low to mid 40s in the middle and upper 20s, low 30s on the sides. Now, one thing I did notice that was weird on the Legion is the space directly to the right of the trackpad is actually a bit warm at about like 40 to 43 degrees. And you can definitely feel it when you have your hand resting on the keyboard here. That's where I think something like a third fan might have helped with this laptop. And then I also did a worst case scenario stress test where you're stressing the CPU and GPU through two different benchmarks at the same time. No, this isn't really realistic of any gaming scenario, but I just wanted to see what would happen. In silent mode first, the G16 would run its CPU at like 30 to 40 watts, 78, 79 degrees. GPU would come in at like 45 watts, 75 degrees. The Legion would run the GPU a little cooler, 40 watts and only 63 degrees. CPU hitting low 70s at 35 watts. Balance mode, the G16 is hitting 30 watts on the CPU at 76 degrees compared to the Legion hitting 47 watts at 72. And then on their GPUs, the G16 is hitting 64 watts at 73 degrees. Legion's hitting 67 watts at 64. And then finally, turbo mode, the G16 is hitting 30 watts on the CPU at 74 degrees. Legion's hitting about 48 watts at 74 degrees as well. So a little more wattage there. GPU is hitting 90 watts at 71 degrees. Legion's GPU is hitting 97 watts at around the same temperature, 70, 71. So yeah, in these stress tests, the Legion is definitely coming out ahead as far as temperatures go. You know, you're getting a little better temps at the same level of wattage. And even when it's a little bit higher in the wattage, it's still hitting around the same level or a little bit lower than the G16. However, in games, it is going to be a little different than this. And we're going to take a look at that in a second. And I like to use control for these wattage tests because at least this area of the game game is very consistent in pushing the GPU or CPU as much as it possibly can, depending on the settings you're running at. So this has always been a really stable test for me, and it doesn't seem to have much variation in how it pushes things. You know, it just kind of takes what you give it. So that's why I like to use this one. All right, so I have the G16 Intel model with the 4090 pulled up here, so you can get an idea of what a vapor chamber and a little more wattage does, as well as the G16 AMD 4070 model, and then the Legion 7i on the bottom right here. Now, if you're in turbo mode and GPU bound, which is most games when you're playing at the native resolution here, this is what you typically be looking at. Our GPUs are all mid 70s across the board, while the CPU stays pretty ice cold on the AMD G16, you know, only using 14 watts, but that's all it really needs, hitting like 69, 70 degrees, whereas the Intel model's hitting 80 there, and then the Legion's kind of in the middle there at 75 with 25 watts, which I'd argue is pretty low for this CPU. If we look back, you know, at like the power scaling graph, it's not much performance coming out of that one at 25 watts compared to these others. Now, if you're CPU bound, like say a game like Helldivers or Counter-Strike, Valorant, something like that, this is probably what you'd be looking at. And CPU bound is sort of where the Legion starts to fall behind because it needs a little more power to give that CPU. And in turn, that temperature gets up there pretty high. You're hitting like, you know, high 80s, mid 90s even at times. I mean, it's pushing it to like 70, 80 watts, which is really high. But, you know, again, remember 43 watts on the AMD model is basically the equivalent of that, while this one's running at low to mid 80s, and same on the Intel G16, just 10 watts less. Now, the Legion does seem to hit like a temp limit or something. It will throttle down to about 50 to 60 watts, and the temps do go down with it to like mid 80s. All right, now we're GPU bound again, but in balance mode this time. So yeah, balance mode GPU bound, we're looking at GPU in like mid 70s on the AMD model, GPUs in the low 70s on the Intel model, and like mid to high 60s on the Legion, which is ice cold for a laptop. All running about the same wattage, but about 10 to 15 watts more on the Intel G16. CPU is staying pretty low across the board here, so not worried about those. Those are good, like low to mid 70s. And now CPU bound in balance mode, you'll see kind of that same behavior on the Legion that it did in turbo, where the CPU just wants to boost to like 75 watts or higher, and it'll hit the 90s before it throttles down to about 50 to 60 watts or so. But even still, it kind of stays around that 80 to 95 degree range. This is where I kind of start to wonder, you know, if it would have been better to put a more efficient CPU, because you can see the G16 here, that CPU, you know, 45 watts, 85 degrees, not too bad. The Intel model, kind of the same upper 70s, 30 watts, and, you know, still performing great. In fact, the G16 is having an easier time hitting 240 FPS than the Legion here at the same settings. And then lastly, silent mode GPU bound. You can see the Legion and the Intel G16 both push the GPU to 55 watts here, low 70s on the G16s, low 60s on the Legion 7i, which is awesome. The AMD G16 for some reason here likes to push the CPU a little bit higher in silent mode, so it's hitting about 10 degrees warmer than the Legion there, and same with the Intel model, but that's just because it runs a little warmer. And then if we're CPU bound in silent mode, the AMD G16 doesn't really change, and the Intel G16 doesn't really change much either. The Legion has the most change here, trying to hit about 60 watts on that CPU, pushing the temperatures in the mid to high 80s once again, and then it kind of throttles down to like 35 watts after a little bit. So yeah, it's mostly when we're like CPU bound is when the Legion starts to fall behind in temperatures. Otherwise, it's mostly ahead of the others as far as thermals go. Okay, now software wise, this is a hard one to say who wins here. The Legion definitely has more customizability in its BIOS, but both of these have plenty of nice options to use in their softwares, whether it's Armory Crate or Lenovo Vantage. I'd say Legion Vantage has a slight edge with its manual mode, giving you more options to balance between CPU and GPU, but it's less obvious what everything does in comparison to Armory Crate's manual mode. Like Armory Crate has a more forgiving fan curve, while Legion's fan curves are honestly more for pushing higher fan speeds than they are for pushing lower fan speeds. And some of the CPU settings might be just downright confusing for some people, but I like the options. And you also have third-party alternatives to each of these softwares. For Asus, you have G-Helper as a replacement for Armory Crate, and Lenovo, you have the Legion Toolkit as a replacement for Vantage. I think both of these are excellent softwares. I think I'd maybe give the advantage to G-Helper just because of how awesome the developer Serge is, and he's so responsive and he updates the program all the time. But Legion Toolkit is still awesome, and both of them have some pretty unique features, so highly recommend you go with either of these softwares no matter which laptop you get. And yeah, I'm speeding through some of the settings here, but you know, feel free to pause or play this back in slow mode if you're trying to catch some of these settings. All right, so now let's get to one of the bigger wins for the Legion, probably the biggest win, and that's the internals. So the G16 features 3 fans, a 90 watt hour battery, standard heat pipes, and an extra SSD slot, as well as a replaceable Wi-Fi card. The Intel model has a pretty nice thermal advantage with 2 fans and a vapor chamber, which is nice to see in such a thin laptop. So otherwise, these are all pretty standard, but the bad thing is your RAM is soldered to the motherboard. I've explained in previous videos that I'm not hugely against this as long as you give consumers the option for different configurations, whether that be 16 gigabytes, 32, or 64, and as long as they're priced reasonably between each tier. But unfortunately, Asus did not get the memo, and you're sort of stuck with only a couple options. If you go with the 4070 Intel model in the US, you're stuck with 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is just sad. It's still fine for a lot of people, but certainly harder to recommend. And on the AMD model, you get 32 gigabytes standard, which is fine, and it'll be great for nearly everyone. I just wish there was a 64 gig option. The three major benefits, though, of this type of RAM, LPDDR5X, is it's extremely fast and low latency, so faster than the Legion's RAM, very low power, which contributes to the battery life, and it takes up much less space on the motherboard, which contributes, to the overall form factor that we have here. Hopefully in the near future, though, we get LPCAMM2, which is small like this, but also still swappable. The Legion, on the other hand, has your standard SODIMM DDR5 RAM. Not quite as fast or efficient, but hey, you can put as much in there as you want. And I know that's going to be a major factor in some people's buying decisions. Ports are pretty similar on both laptops. One cool thing is the G16 actually has DisplayPort 2.1 versus 1.4, so that gives it a higher bandwidth of 80 gigabits versus 32, which means you could technically run an 8K monitor at 120 Hz if you were insane for some reason and wanted to do that on the G16. And the SD card reader is also faster on the G16, and it features faster USB-A ports, being Gen 2 over the Gen 1 ports on the Legion. But the rest is basically the same. All right, let's get down to the GPU and gaming benchmark here. I think this is where many people are going to be quite shocked, because I see this a lot in Reddit posts where people are just saying, hey, the Legion performs better. It's bigger, it has more wattage, it's going to perform better. But that's not quite the case. So first of all, both of these laptops have the same GPU, but there are some key differences. The Legion has the RTX 4070 running at 140 watts, while the Intel G16 has its RTX 4070 running at 115 watts. And the AMD model is a little lower at 105 watts. This is going to make people automatically think that the Legion performs better in games, but due to Nvidia's voltage limit, you'll see that that's not actually the case. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google Nvidia's voltage limit on 40 series laptop GPUs. So basically anything over 100 watts on the 4050, 4060, or 4070 all runs about the same, whether it's 100 watts flat or a full 140 watts. It just doesn't matter on these GPUs, unfortunately. Now, that's Nvidia's fault, so don't blame Lenovo here. Otherwise, this could have been a very different story, and it makes me argue, why in 2024 anyone would even want a big, bulky 4070 laptop when you can get just about the same performance out of something much smaller, but I digress. And as far as GPU options go, there is another silent win here for the G16, and that's the availability of 4080 and 4090 options. The 4080 and 4090 feature the Intel Core 9 Ultra and not the AMD HX CPU for some dumb reason, but they run at 10 watts more, so 125 watts, which is of course less than the 175 watts that these GPUs are allowed, but regardless, they still offer way more gaming performance than either of these 4070s here, and you're going to see that in the charts. And you can find them for pretty good prices when they're on sale even. I definitely wouldn't leave them completely out of this comparison. So let's take a look. So yeah, if we're looking at strictly time spy scores here, the Legion is just barely ahead. I mean, a couple hundred points in time spy really means nothing. It's almost margin of error. So that's good to see them both about the same level there. In balance mode, Legion pulls a little ahead, and then silent mode, the Legion's a little further ahead, which is about the same case on battery as well. But the G16 does pull ahead on USB-C and way ahead on integrated graphics, although there is no way to actually game on the integrated graphics on the Legion, unfortunately. But the iGPU that goes with those HX CPUs is just not the greatest. The AMD G16 and the Core Ultra model are both some of the highest performing integrated graphics you can get on a CPU right now. Also, I know 3D Mark's been moving to Steel Nomad from Time Spy, so I have those scores here as well, and they're also about the same there too. Another thing you might have seen in a review floating out there was inconsistent performance on the G16. I debunked this really in the first review I put out for the G16, and I talked about it again in the AMD model review. But yeah, that's not really present here at all. I think that might have been maybe an earlier BIOS or earlier review units that got sent out. I had a lot of people test this, including myself, and that's just not the case. It performs very consistent. You can run a benchmark 20 times and it still gets the same result. So definitely not an issue here. So let's take a look at these gaming benchmarks, because I know y'all been waiting for that. I definitely don't recommend skipping this part. I know a lot of people do, but I try to make these results a little interesting and explain why I think one laptop might be performing better or why they might be tied, or you might see some data here that even shocks you. So starting with Cyberpunk, I had old versions of this benchmark in red here because those are probably lower now than they were earlier. This benchmark just has scored lower over time, so just keep that in mind. But it doesn't really apply much between these two laptops. We are both getting 61 FPS on the Ultra preset, so they kind of just keep about even in this benchmark. Even in in balance mode, you can see them just a few FPS apart depending on the settings that you're using. Sometimes the G16 is ahead, sometimes the Legion's ahead, same with silent mode. And I also look at 4K, even though it's not super feasible here, but they get about the same there as well. Next, we'll look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is kind of like my gold standard. And here, both laptops are again just a few FPS apart. Unless you're playing in 1080p, then the Legion does pull ahead just a little bit. And it's the same story in balance mode and silent mode, with both performing about the same. And also have this one on battery and USB-C. And you can see the Legion pulls ahead a little bit on battery, and the G16 pulls ahead a little bit on USB-C. And then 4K, they're both about the same again. And here's a new one I've added is Black Myth Wukong, because I know a lot of people have been playing that one and requesting it. But again, no surprises here. They're about the same on the FPS here. Just a few more FPS on the Legion. And kind of the same story on Final Fantasy 16, which is another one that has also been requested. And the G16 is kind of coming into the lead here. It's oddly like right up against almost the 4090 G14, which is usually way ahead. So that was kind of interesting. Same deal in balance mode. G16 pulls ahead of the Legion. And then silent mode, the Legion is 1 FPS ahead, but lower 1% lows. This was also kind of interesting. In 4K on this game, for some reason, the G16 was doing way better than the Legion here. Couldn't really figure that out, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. Forza Horizon 5, another similar story. You can see they're pretty neck and neck. Legion's a little bit ahead, but if we go to balance and silent mode, they are much closer. This might be the biggest lead it has over all the benchmarks, is this one in silent mode. For some reason, Legion does really well here. And then 4K, again, they're just 1 FPS apart. Helldivers 2 can rely pretty heavily on the CPU. That's why I'm not surprised to see the Legion ahead a little bit here. But then once we're in balance and silent mode, that difference is minimal. Red Dead Redemption 2, again, neck and neck, both scoring 65 FPS. Horizon Zero Dawn, Legion's just 4 FPS ahead, nothing crazy there. I want to point out though that this is where these 4080 and 4090 laptops come in. If you haven't noticed, they can be way ahead of both of these guys, especially in like 4K where that VRAM comes into play a lot more. And again, that is an option for you. If you go the G16 route, you can get the 4080 or 4090 model. And I've seen the 4080 go on sale for the same price as the 4070 even. So just something to think about, you know? Starfield again has both neck and neck. So we're starting to see this pattern here where they are performing almost the same in nearly every game, outside of a few where I suspect the CPU is coming into play, or maybe some of that core-to-core latency that we talked about earlier. Like Modern Warfare 3, you get a little bit worse 1% lows on the G16, even though the FPS is about the same. And then Control, which is super GPU heavy, again, about the same. Even with DLSS on, the G16 pulls ahead just a little bit here, but nothing crazy. And lastly, Apex Legends. Again, we are about the same with the Legion, for some reason having pretty low 1% lows on this one. Don't really know why, but overall average FPS was about the same here. I think this game just needed a little more CPU juice than the Legion could give it, but still not a bad result. So that's your gaming benchmarks. I know that's not super exciting, but I at least hope that it kind of helps squash the rumors and belief that like you're going to get so much more performance out of the Legion when that's just not the case. Maybe that'll change with the 50 series RTX cards, but as for 40 series, it's just not going to happen unless you go 4080 or 4090. All right, so who wins here? Well, let's see what each of these laptops have going for it. So in favor of the Legion, we have a quieter silent mode under load, 140 watts USB-C power delivery with the Lenovo charger, a numpad if that's your thing, per key RGB keyboard, slightly higher peak performance on the CPU, more options in the BIOS and Lenovo Vantage, and of course, no soldered RAM. In favor of the G16, we have a much smaller and lighter build with a smaller charging brick, a CNC body that looks extremely sleek, better ports with DisplayPort 2.1 and Gen 2, and faster SD card reader, just about double the battery life or more, 0 RPM fans in silent mode under light loads, much better speakers, better webcam and mic, a larger, quieter trackpad, more key travel, much better display being OLED, insane performance in Photoshop and Lightroom on the AMD model, a CPU that performs better between 5 and 80 watts, where most CPUs tend to run. This is, of course, the AMD model. The Intel running better between 5 and 60 watts. A GPU that performs nearly the same in games despite being lower wattage. Faster RAM. What I'd argue is a better third-party app with ghelper, or at least more supported. And the availability of 4080 and 4090 models for much higher gaming performance and lower fan noise than either of these. And then the things we have in common here is you get about the same fan noise and keyboard temperatures. Depending on which mode you're in, the Legion's sometimes warmer like it is on the bottom, and under certain loads it also tends to be warmer in the middle. And also the Legion sort of has a warm spot to the right of the trackpad, but overall pretty close. And thermals are actually kind of similar on both due to the Intel chips running pretty warm on the Legion, whereas the AMD G16 runs surprisingly cool for how small it is. Although overall though, the Legion does win here in thermals. But these are things that I just frequently see people get wrong when they're talking about these laptops, so I just thought I'd point those out. All right, so final thoughts. So I know I might get some hate here, but to me this is an easy win for the the G16. Like, you're getting essentially the same performance, fan noise, and at times even better thermals than the Legion, despite it being much thinner, lighter, and more compact. And with that, you get better speakers, a beautiful OLED display, the ports, the battery life. The Intel Core Ultra is very efficient, and the AMD CPU is even more efficient, beating out the Intel 14900HX all the way up to 80 watts, which again, you'll almost never see in games anyway. Most games are going to have the CPU at like 20 to 50 watts, which is where the AMD and Intel Core Ultra CPU just dominate. To me, it's a no-brainer, but maybe I'm blinded by how much I've personally enjoyed the G16. I've been testing and daily driving these both side by side now for almost 2 months, and it's just so much harder to put down the G16. It just does such a good job being more than just a gaming laptop with all the quality of life features. I definitely will give it to the Legion though, and having swappable RAM. That's going to be the #1 factor for some people, and of course better thermals in certain situations. But man, it would be really hard for me to personally trade all of those nice premium features of the G16 just for that. I edited a lot of this video in 4K with tons of layers, and the 32GB AMD model was a breeze there. Even editing on the Intel 4090 model, it was even smoother than that, and I never felt a need for 64GB. So, but I'd say the US really got shafted with the 16GB Intel 4070 model. Like, they really should have given a 32GB option there. And while it might be fine for a lot of people still, it could start to show some constraint when you're doing these sorts of things like editing 4K video. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not trying to hate on Lenovo here. I still think the Legion 7i is the best laptop in their Legion lineup, and I still think Lenovo is one of the best laptop manufacturers out there. Like I have some MSI and Alienware and HP laptops here as well. It's way better than those, but I just want to see it improved upon is all. I want to see a little innovation, you know? Like, they're so close to making something that is truly special. Just give us at least one Legion option that can fit into the truly like portable hybrid laptop category, like the Zephyrus, and this might have been a different outcome. You know, just one option without a numpad, give it up firing speakers, more portable than this one, premium display options, and they'd be dominating. I also think if the Legion 7i would have been offered with a 4080 or 4090 GPU running at like 150 watts, I might have recommended that one over everything here. But sadly, Lenovo decided to cap this out at a 4070, which is just so weird to me. Like, why put the same ultra high-end CPU in your thinner laptops that you have in the bigger Pro 7i, where it can't even hit its peak performance anyway, but then only max it out at like a mid-tier GPU that also can't even reach its full potential because of Nvidia's voltage limit. And then even having an ultra high-end CPU like this in a more portable offering doesn't really make sense, because with a focus on portability, that should also bring at least some focus on having decent battery life. So I don't really know what the thought process there was. I'd almost say if you prefer Legion, to just wait for the 4080 Legion Pro 7i to go on sale instead. Like, I wish they would have done like Asus did and used the Intel Core Ultra chip instead of this and max it out with like a 4080 or 4090. It would have just been insane competition, but at the current configurations available, I just don't think it's really that competitive. I mean, to me, it's not really a proper lightweight gaming laptop. It's just like kind of big, but sort of thin, kind of light, but not that light, and with no major benefits for doing so. But yeah, I still think these are both excellent laptops, and price would definitely be something that would sway me towards either one. But as of now, the G16 Intel 4070 model has gone as low as $1399 at Best Buy, and that's just unbeatable. You'd basically be paying $600 less than the Legion and $900 less than the AMD G16 at that point. The Legion goes on sale too for around $200 to $300 off, but I haven't seen it happen nearly as often or as low as the G16 has gone on sale for. Although I do argue that the AMD model of the G16 being $300 more than the Legion 7i is a little iffy. It is a harder sell, but it has already gone on sale, so at retail price, it still might be worth it though if you really want that AMD efficiency, or again, just wait for a sale to happen. But I want to reinforce the point that you should not ignore the 4080 and 4090 G16s here. Like, these have each gone on sale for almost the same price as the AMD G16. Shoot, the 4080 open box I've seen go for even cheaper than the AMD G16. And if you're after like gaming or video editing performance, that one's going to put you way ahead compared to all of these. So if you want to see my review for that one, check it out on my channel where I have it linked here. And I'll have purchase links in the description and a pinned comment in case you decide to get any of these laptops. Those are affiliate links and they really help the channel out, so greatly appreciate if you go that route. But yeah, I hope you found something useful in this video. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.